your identity is limited, it makes it very difficult for yourself to be that warrior in the garden, because you start to be triggered and destroyed by very minute things that violate the narrative of yourself. So this idea of limited identity actually comes from a yogi named Sadhguru, who I'm a big fan of. And Sadhguru will talk about this idea of limited identity as being the root of all of our human conflict. And the fact that we think of ourselves as a single thing, right? If you attach a label to yourself and you identify with it, this could be anything, right? Your label could be, I view myself as this political affiliation, or I view myself as an angry person, or a depressed person, or an emotional person. And when you throw these labels upon yourself and you begin to identify with them, what you end up doing simultaneously is, by identifying with a specific thing, you simultaneously cut off a lot of other things that allow your being to be expansive in your experience of life. So for instance, if I view myself on one side of an argument, let's say I view myself, as a liberal or a conservative, then automatically the other side I'm viewing as wrong. I'm viewing it as against my identity. And to be a good liberal or conservative, I now have to hold opinions against the opposing party or the opposing viewpoint. And by doing so, now I've limited myself and I begin to close myself off. I begin to lose myself because I'm attaching to something that is not myself. And this particular lesson is something that I learned from not just Sadhguru with the idea of limited identity, but there is a Zen concept that was talked about by Thich Nhat Hanh, where he talks about how teaching is like a raft. Teaching is like a raft that brings you from one side of the river to the other. Once you get to the other side of the river, you don't carry the raft on your head. I'll explain this in a better way. He explained how the teaching or the method is more like a finger pointing at the moon. So this metaphor, the way that it breaks down, is that the finger pointing at the moon, we could say, this is the identity, right? In this particular case, the identity points at the moon, and the moon represents the truth or the actual experience that you're trying to point to. If you get attached to the identity, then you start to concentrate on the finger and you forget about the moon entirely. We don't want to mistake the finger pointing at the moon for being the moon itself. So if we are locking onto an identity because we believe that it gives us meaning, we believe that we're championing something good, yet we're at the same time we're losing ourselves, then what we're doing is we're forgetting about the truth, we're forgetting about our direct experience, and instead we just start to serve the thing that's pointing at it. We get lost in the method rather than actually embracing the truth and the direct experience that life is, and the truth and direct experience of who we are. We are much more than anything that we could identify with. And having a total view of life, or an integral view of life, as we like to say when it comes to Zen Stoicism, is being able to realize that you are not just your emotions. You are not your past. You are not your political ideologies or even your religious ideologies. You're so much more than that. Sure, these things may be a part of you and they may be important to you, and that is completely fine. But they do not define the entire person that you are or could be. So by getting locked on these things, we severely limit ourselves to the experience of our self-realization, as well as the experience of the deepest meaning that we could attain in our lives, right? We stunt our growth towards our full potential when we limit ourselves. So when we go into this idea of limited identity is at the root of our problems, because by seeing ourselves as limited, what we end up doing is we end up resisting other people's subjective experience and not realizing that everybody's having their own unique experience, and that just because someone does something doesn't mean that it's a personal attack towards us just because it falls outside of the limitations of our identity and the limitations of our narrative of ourselves. So we want to not allow ourselves to get stuck in this style of thinking, because by doing so, it cuts us off from connecting with other people. Just through these last 2 years with this pandemic, I've heard so many stories about people not talking to family members because they disagreed on certain issues. People no longer allowing themselves to have certain friends because their friends believe something different than they did. And in that, people have lost their ability to see the moon, and they started focusing on the finger that points to the moon. And having those limited identities have wiped out relationships, marriages, families, friendships. And this is all because of a limited identity of seeing yourself as in a box and only having to agree with what is contained within that box. And that could be detrimental for us. So instead of having that limited identity, one exercise that I really love is something that comes from Marcus Aurelius, which is called taking the view from above. Now, when Marcus Aurelius talks about this in Meditations, and for those of you who don't know Marcus Aurelius is one of the most prominent Stoic philosophers who was a Roman emperor, meaning that at the time, he was the most powerful man in the world. And somehow, some way, did not allow himself to get corrupted by that level of power because he used Stoicism. He practiced Stoicism to consistently examine his character, to consistently make sure that he was living a life that he believed was in the direction of a virtuous life, a meaningful life. And he used philosophy as his way of character examination so that he wasn't getting lost in the power. He wasn't getting lost in the abundance of choice that he had. Now, he had this exercise that he would do where he called it taking the view from above. And taking the view from above was basically Marcus Aurelius imagining himself, viewing not just himself through his own experience, but having an objective view of himself, kind of like zooming out, and then seeing not just himself, but the community that he was in, seeing all the nature within it, the animals, the people, the merchants in the shop, in the market, the soldiers training, babies being born, seeing all of this and taking in this expansive view and realizing that he is part of all of this. He's part of nature, and it is not separate from him. So as human beings, we are made for each other. We are made to cooperate, and we are not separate from one another. And Marcus Aurelius would use this exercise called taking the view from above to expand his identity, not just from I am the Roman emperor and I get to decide, but that I am a human, I am a man, and I choose to be a good man. I choose to be someone who is connected with the people around me. Because in this realization and in his reflections, Marcus Aurelius would consistently come back to this theme of, as human beings, our nature is cooperation. Our nature is to come together. So by taking this perspective consistently and by always examining and reflecting on his character, Marcus Aurelius was a seeker of wisdom. And as a seeker of wisdom, what he was doing was he was building a universal identity. He was not locking himself into a specific way of thinking just because he was the Roman emperor and because he had this power and he had this status in life. But he used philosophy, as Seneca would say, to scrape off of his faults rather than to rail against the faults of others. And with a limited identity, it's really easy for us to criticize others. It's really easy for us to use our intelligence and our intellect to cut others out and to judge other people based on what they might be going through, not realizing that as human beings, we all go through something similar. And this whole idea reminds me of this. One of my coaches one time made this distinction to me where he said it's really important to distinguish the difference between aloneness and loneliness. And loneliness happens when we have limited identity, because loneliness is viewing your subjective experience and thinking to yourself, I'm the only one who feels this way. I'm the only one going through this. No one understands. And it's starting to attach the experiences that you're having, the emotions that you're having to your actual identity, to how you view yourself. Whereas aloneness can sometimes be just a state of affairs, a literal observation of your circumstances where you are actually just alone in the room that you're in, on the path that you're walking, in the endeavor that you're going. But at the same time, it's to remember that there are other people on this path. There are other people having their own very unique, novel, subjective experiences. And to realize that even if those novel, subjective experiences are completely different from ours, the fact that we're having unique, novel, and subjective experiences is one of the things that connects us, that we all have that subjective experience where we're able to realize that, hey, maybe mine is novel and unique, And that's beautiful because that makes me who I am. That's part of the thing that I'm going to embrace in life, but other people are also having this. So yes, sometimes when we're walking our path in life, we are alone. We are alone in the specifics that we're experiencing. But we're not alone in the fact that we all have these types of subjective experiences. And when you are seeking knowledge, when you're seeking wisdom, when you're seeking a life that you're using philosophy to examine your character to become that warrior in the garden, there will be times where this path can be lonesome, or you will be alone, because it's very much like there are a lot of people in life that they'd rather not think about what they're going through. They'd rather not examine their character, and they'd rather just view it from the egoic lens of my perception, my specific individual experience, my ego is me. And everything that happens is personal to me, and that's just the way that it is. And that can be a severely limited view. And in doing so, it's almost like having a path that is well paved, where you don't have to think, you don't have to do anything, you just kind of walk the path, and things are simple and easy. You never reflect back on your character, you never practice any self-awareness, and it's a comfortable way of existing, except for when you have the rude awakenings or the inevitable storms that come through life. But then there's the path of the seeker of wisdom, the philosopher, where you're using philosophy to help you scrape off all the parts of yourself that are not you. You're using philosophy to examine your character, to reflect upon your decisions, upon your intentions. And this can be more like taking the path that is not paved, taking the path that is rugged and filled with foliage. Maybe it's up a mountain, maybe it's rocky. And sometimes when you're on that path and you look around, sometimes you might see other seekers of wisdom on this path, far off in the distance, coming up the mountain. And other times, you might be there completely by yourself. And that is that experience of aloneness. But what's important to remember is that aloneness, that unique experience, brings us back to the fact that because you're having this experience, because it's temporary, because it is alone, this is part of what makes it meaningful. This is part of what makes it unique and beautiful, because at the end of the day, what defines you and what validates you is not the fact that you are doing specific endeavors in life, not the fact that you have accumulated certain things in your life. It is the fact that you are here. It is the message of you. The very fact that you're here in life is all the validation that you need. And sometimes that can feel like you're alone, but you do not have to feel lonely. Because it's important to remember that as human beings, we're all going through it. And sometimes the most important thing that we can do for ourselves and for others is to empathize with the experience of others, to remember that we're not alone in this, to remember that other people feel this way, that this is unique to the human experience. And that is what it is to be a seeker of wisdom. That is what it is to practice philosophy, is to allow that philosophy to help you cut off the limitations of your identity and to also bring you back into a state where you remember that you are part of this human experience. You are universal. You're not limited in your identity.